Hi, my name's William Gates. I'm a doctoral candidate at Northeastern University in the College of Professional Studies in Boston, Massachusetts. The work I'm presenting today is titled Curating Exclusion, Analyzing the Legacy of Redlining in Contemporary Museum Spaces. I'd like to start by looking at a quote from Winston Churchill that reads, "First we shape our buildings, and thereafter they shape us." Buildings communicate through spatial meaning, crafting educational experiences that question our identities, values, and aspirations. They are existential constructs. Museums can foster commonality, community bonds, and peaceful coexistence, or become merchants of division, selling stories of subjugation and supremacy that erode empathy and recognition of common humanity. As repositories of knowledge and culture, museums significantly influence art perception through spatial organization and curatorial choices that may perpetuate narratives of whiteness and cultural hierarchy. This study examines these patterns to critically analyze museum practices and their impact on marginalized communities. By unpacking how space utilization and artwork presentation contribute to spatial racialization, this research advances conversations about inclusivity and representation within cultural institutions. Understanding museums as knowledge gatekeepers is essential for dismantling racialized oppression and renewing public educational spaces. There are words by Hans Haack that read, "Museums are managers of consciousness. They give us an interpretation of history, of how to view the world and locate ourselves in it." The background and context of this research. In contemporary public educational spaces, pedagogies of exclusion perpetuate bias and prejudice through inheritances of spatial subjugation and injustice in the United States. This exclusion often lacks descriptive semantic structure necessary for disclosure and dialogue as tools of division and discrimination. This work seeks to define and establish in the public discourse these hidden languages of disenfranchisement. British architect David A.J. recently said, "Buildings are deeply emotive structures. People think they're just things we maneuver through, but the makeup of a person is influenced by the nature of spaces." Goals. This work seeks to define a critical spatial analytical theory that addresses museums and public educational spaces as defining cultural institutions and how their architecture can perpetuate discrimination, oppression, and white supremacy through systemic normative gaze and spatial architectural microaggressions, thereby perpetuating inequality and disenfranchisement. This redlining of educational space acknowledges embedded racism in institutional structures and behaviors as foundational to understanding the oppressive language of space and place. In the United States, museums are our most trusted public institutions. They are vital as sources of historical information and artistic wisdom, and our people look to them as community spaces, defining collective aspirations and establishing beauty and cultural meaning. Therefore, museums must not perpetuate racism through spatial microaggressions and racial frames within white-dominated structures. As society and governments rewrite history to maintain white supremacy, this work makes visible spatial designs undermining equity and creates new terms addressing continued disenfranchisement of marginalized communities. What is redlining? Redlining is a term used in the creation of maps by the Federal Housing Authority and the U.S. government's home ownership program to delineate neighborhoods that were or were likely to become populated by Black people for the purpose of disqualifying them from social assistance and federally subsidized housing loans, which they would otherwise have been qualified for. It was also the practice of deliberate disenfranchisement and segregation of racial and ethnic minorities by demarking the communities and neighborhoods where they lived and resided for maps used to determine eligibility for federal and social benefits that white populated communities were entitled to. And it was the practice in the US during the early 20th century of racially or ethnically segregating communities or populations of minorities for the purpose of spatially subjugating those communities and the propagation of white supremacy and privilege. The institutions live in the spaces. Those are the words of Louis Kahn, American architect. He also said that a building is a community of spaces. Museums are often organized like this. Different communities are the different galleries, and they're organized typically according to geographic or ethnic origin of the artifacts or the art. I began to notice patterns in visiting museums in the United States, patterns that echoed the historic practice of redlining. So I created what I'm calling a redlining analytical framework, which looks at 10 different factors in the experience of museums, from lighting to ceiling height, to wall color, to furniture, to the memorabilia that's sold in the gift shops. What is the message of memorabilia? Typically, museum gift shops in the United States predominantly feature reproductions of white European artists, conveying messages about which art is valued and how museums seek to be remembered. Or factor 10 of my redlining analytical framework. It's the juxtapositional language of experience. This photograph, next to factor 10, demonstrates a redlining factor. African art is positioned below in darker, compact spaces, while European art is placed above in natural light, with soaring ceiling heights, creating feelings of freedom versus confinement and danger. Research questions. What is the public experience of museums as educational spaces that have a responsibility to center social justice in the experiences they craft in their exhibitions and spaces? What are the critical terms and definitions that refer to spatial inequities and subjugation? And how can museums work to better center social justice so that the public experiences them as welcoming and inclusive community spaces? The following spatial factors and criteria can be used to redline museums and public educational spaces. It is a way to critically analyze and understand the languages and meanings in architecture and their experiences of social educational spaces and museums. Factor 1 of the redlining analytical framework is the spatial allocation of art based on its origin and the dramatic difference in the generous allocation of space for the art of some cultural origins and the compressed experiences of others. Factor 2, the vertical height related to the display of art on its geographic origin. Factor 3, the measure of light, both natural and artificial, can contribute significantly to the emotions experienced in space. This measure draws on the natural human attraction to light and away from darkness, known as phototropism. In this way, the spaces of our museums can serve to communicate notions of white supremacy, racial hierarchy, and oppression, further reinforcing inequality and racial division in the language of spatial microaggressions. Factor 4, as revealed in the photos, in the African and ancient Egyptian galleries, the wall colors are darker and less vivid, while in the ancient Roman and Greek galleries, they have lighter colored walls with vivid color. Factor 5, the vertical distribution of art across a museum. Typically, as you move through space vertically, the most important spaces are reserved for the upper floors. This also correlates to the idea that as you move through a museum, you are gaining wisdom and insight. Factor 6, the architectural gesture of an entry space. Entry spaces bring you into the building, into the museum, and the gesture of this space typically crafts a beautiful neoclassical staircase with painted ceilings domes, and vaults. The immediate message is to tell you where the most important works of art are and what they are, that they are on the second floor, and that they are the works of ancient Greek and Rome and European art. Factor 7, furniture. This bare wooden bench in the African art gallery contrasts significantly from the other furniture in this museum. Factor 8, controversial collections. Museums, as social educational spaces, should seek to disclose controversies surrounding artifacts in their collections. Increasingly, the means by which museums have obtained their collections are being critically and ethically viewed. The idea of an encyclopedia collection entails the full disclosure of contention relating to the art on display. Factor 9, the message of memorabilia. What is the message of memorabilia? Increasingly, social public educational spaces have incorporated gift shops into their experience. However, the overwhelming proportion of merchandise available are reproductions of white European artists. The message conveyed is what art is worthy and valued, and how museums seek to be remembered. And factor 10, the juxtapositional language of experience. The photo on the previous slide expresses several redlining analytical factors at work. The African art is below and in a darker, lower, more densely compact space, in contrast to the European art being placed above and in a space that has natural light with high skylights, which contributes to the feeling of being free to act on your curiosity and being free from the fear and danger that accompany dark and poorly lit spaces. Based on these 10 factors, I created new terms that will help broaden the dialogue and communication around these spatial microaggressions. They are defined in a critical spatial theory. These terms are redlining analytical framework, an analytical framework developed to identify spatial architectural microaggressions and inequalities in the social and public educational experience, an analytical framework that draws on the historical practice of redlining in the United States to identify spatial cultural inequities in the experience of museums, buildings, and educational spaces that foster biased hierarchical perspectives in crafting understanding and experiences. Redline spatial culture, the social and psychological disposition of accepting spatial disparity and inequity based on the racial or ethnic identity and on economic class. A culture like the United States that deepens and reinforces the structural divisions and institutional violence towards racial and ethnic minorities through spatial inequality, inequity, and allocation. Spatial discrimination, the institutionalized and or internalized practice of disenfranchising racial and ethnic minorities and people of color from equality in architectural and spatial representation in the public educational experience for the purpose or with the effect of racial subjugation and perpetuation of white supremacy. Spatial microaggression, a subtle racialized spatial experience or inequity in spatial context that results in discrimination towards ethnic minorities and people of color. The institutionalized disparity of spatial experience based on ethnic and or geographic origin or racial identity. 3. The disequilibrium of spatial experience and hierarchical allocation of spatial resources based on racial identity that results in the subjugation of ethnic minorities, the perpetuation of white supremacy, and the dissolution of human commonality and equality. 4. Subtle spatial characteristics, often working in concert to craft experiences and create a context that reinforces racial stereotypes and perpetuates bias and discrimination. 5. the physical, spatial, and architectural manifestations of racism directed towards racial and ethnic minorities and people of color. 6. The physical and spatial inequities based on race and ethnic identity that craft experiences in social and public educational spaces. Museum examples include placing European art on upper floors and African and indigenous art in the basement or on lower floors, lower ceiling heights in African and indigenous art exhibition spaces, and ceiling heights and higher ceiling heights in European art exhibition spaces, lower levels of illumination in African and indigenous art spaces, and brighter levels of illumination in European art spaces, a compact spatial allocation of art for indigenous and African art, and a more generous spatial allocation for European arts. Spatial subjugation, the subtle, cumulative, and pervasive spatial architectural features that craft a racially biased and discriminatory context through which educational experiences are navigated. A pattern of inequitable spatial distinctions that establish, conveys, and perpetuates white Eurocentric supremacy in the United States and the subjugation of racial and ethnic minorities. The subjugation within educational spaces like museums of distinct architectural experiences correlating to the geographic or ethnic origin of art and artifacts. A biased spatial hierarchy within the experience of architectural space that includes a Eurocentric spatial supremacy and a spatial subjugation of racial and ethnic minorities. Spatial subjugation, the relegation to less desirable spatial circumstances and representation of racial and ethnic minorities and people of color, resulting in the perpetuation of pervasive racism in our society and the reinforcing of internal bias and white supremacy and privilege. The limits of my language are the limits of my world. In 1922, those words were spoken by Ludwig Wittgenstein. It really speaks to the power of words and how new terms and new words can give semantic structure and meaning to common experiences. Conclusion. Architecture speaks to us. It is a language that communicates meaning and fosters human activity and ways of living and being. It is the silent language of material, light, and space, organized for the flourishing of human culture or for the perpetuation of subjugation. Architecture can heal divisions among peoples, or it can foster them. It is therefore extremely relevant that the experiences of museums do not perpetuate the inherited and enduring injustices of the United States, of inequality and false superiority, in the silent languages of their spatial design and order. In the cause of advancing social justice and equity in the United States, this project seeks to address the persistent inertia of our inherited systems and institutions that perpetuate the continued suffering of our people and foster divisions and disenfranchisement within our communities. The responsibility that is entangled within my experiences and education oblige me to act to improve the lives of those that continue to suffer in the United States. This work develops new terms, new semantic structure and description to describe spatial disparities based on race and cultural origin, seeking to bring these concepts into the public discourse to foster a fuller dialogue about institutional racism in the United States. These spaces and experiences museums craft to facilitate human flourishing are the physical manifestations of a culture's ideals. As static and enduring frameworks, they pass meaning on from one generation to the next, making it extremely relevant that museums do not perpetuate inherited injustice and false superiority in their spatial designs. Thank you so much for listening.